called them bad words, dirty, filthy, foul, vile, vulgar, coarse, in poor taste, unseemly, street talk, gutter talk, locker room language, barracks talk, bawdy, naughty, saucy, raunchy, rude, crude, lewd, lascivious, indecent, profane, obscene, blue, off-color, risque, suggestive, cursing, cussing, swearing, and all I could think of was mother and
Before the 1970s, American culture placed a heavy stigma on profanity. The Hays Code prevented any swearing in movies, and laws prevented public use of obscene language. However, public sentiment began to change starting in the early 70s. For example, use of words like and has steadily increased since the early 70s. In addition, the 1970s gave way to the counterculture movement, which sought to break down traditional roles and taboos. One of the effects of this was decreasing the stigma of swear words. George Carlin's 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television exemplified the countercultural opinion on language and served as the start of a discussion that led to the continual degrading of the taboos commonly placed on so-called bad language.
Before we can look at how this routine affected the United States, let us take a step back and look at the man behind it. George Carlin was born in New York City in 1937. At an early age, he took on the role of class clown, finding amusing ways to entertain his friends and classmates. After this, he worked in radio and started his comedy career around 1960. He initially received success doing comedy the way everyone did in the 60s, clean and fine for the censors of the Ed Sullivan Show. However, Lenny Bruce, an eventual friend of Carlin, would buck this trend. He swore and had lengthy routines disparaging the Catholic Church. This caused him to be arrested and have constant legal troubles. Carlin witnessed Lenny Bruce's rise and fall and eventual bankruptcy and death. Bruce was never accepted in his time, but Carlin appreciated his work. With all that in mind, in the late 60s, Carlin felt restricted, and he wanted to go further. He felt like his true self was not being represented on stage.
This is what Kelly Carlin, George Carlin's daughter, had to say about George Carlin's change in his comedy around the early 70s.
He was basically a counterculture person on the inside, and he had adopted this straight persona because that's who was successful and who was on television. Back in those days, you had to look like that to be on television. He wasn't part of pop music or anything where that had a lot more freedom at that time. And in the late 60s, he also dropped a bit of acid, and that really changed his mindset and the way he saw the world and the planet and his own identity. And he realized that who he was not being represented in his work, and he needed to become more authentic to himself.
Be some words we won't say all the time. And I was just trying to find out which words they were. For sure, all of them. I wanted a list. Because nobody gives you a list. That's the problem. They don't give you a list. Wouldn't you think it'd be normal if they didn't want you to say something to tell you what it is? Nobody even tells you when you're a kid what the words are that you're supposed to avoid. You have to say them to find out which ones they are.
So George Carlin set about finding that list, and he found one. 7 words you could never say on television.
You know the 7, don't you, that you can't say on television? Huh?
James Sullivan, the author of 7 Dirty Words, The Life and Crimes of George Carlin, said this about George Carlin's infamous routine.
His whole line of thinking was, actions are bad. Like violence is bad, war is bad, discrimination is bad, but words can't actually hurt you. So he was trying to make a point about that. And specifically what he was doing was saying, apparently the Federal Communication Commission has decided there are certain words that you are not allowed to say on TV, but because they're hyper nervous about the words, they won't say what they are.
This infamous routine gained Carlin the respect of the young hippies, who loved his deconstruction of these words and the taboos around them.
Everyone younger than him loved it because it was very freeing, and he was very much a truth teller. And he was questioning the use of language and words in ways that it was provocative, but also really thoughtful.
But the younger audiences, thought he was hilarious and were happy that he was, talking up front about Vietnam and smoking pot and all the things that he talked, and long hair, talking about all that.
This younger audience of hippies were part of the counterculture movement. They pushed for individuality and freedom of expression. They enjoyed that Carlin was pointing out the hypocrisy of the U.S. government that was trying to suppress so-called bad language, but at the same time they were drafting young men to die in Vietnam.
To explore the change in American swearing over time, we conducted a survey of over 50 movies spanning from 1960 to 2000. The movies we surveyed were R-rated American films. This is because other ratings cannot use the word f***, so we decided to exclusively look at R-rated films. To do this, we used the statistics on VidAngel. We tabulated it all and made a graph of the averages from each decade. It starts with very little use of f*** in the 60s, but after 1970, it significantly rises by a factor of 18 times. Then, as you can see, it continues to rise and rise. The most significant part of this graph is the increase in the use of the word f*** between 1970 and 1975, because that is the time Carlin started performing the 7 words you can never say on television. We are not saying that Carlin caused this increase, but rather Carlin began a discussion on these words, and this discussion led to more swearing.
George Carlin and his legendary routine would also have an incredible influence on stand-up comedy, with many comedians going further than he did. They saw him use swear words, and eventually the medium would become infamous for pushing the line.
Comedians definitely started getting raunchier, pushing the buttons a lot more. In the 80s, there were tons of comics like Sam Kinison or Dice Clay or Bill Hicks who, definitely were not shy about swearing, definitely didn't care about presenting a clean act. He sort of broke the doors open for that.
These celebrated comedians, Sam Kinison, Andrew Dice Clay, and Bill Hicks, were infamous for their off-the-wall and offensive material. Sam Kinison enraged audiences with some of his homophobic material. Andrew Dice Clay similarly infuriated crowds with misogynistic routines, and Bill Hicks was banned from The Tonight Show. In addition, all these comedians used words like f*** and
Academy Award winner and legendary comedian Stephen Wright had this to say on the 7 words routine's influence on stand-up comedy.
He's like on the Mount Rushmore of comedians. He's a genius.
Comedians saw Carlin use these words, and they began to emulate him. One comedian who was influenced by Carlin is Stephen Wright, who grew up watching Carlin perform on The Tonight Show.
And incredible influence on not only on me, on a lot of people in my generation of comedy would say the same thing.
Carlin influenced not only Stephen Wright, but many others, including Dave Attell, Bill Burr, Chris Rock, Jerry Seinfeld, and Louis C.K. Even though George Carlin died on June 22, 2008, his legacy will live on. 50 years ago, his legendary routine challenged the status quo that was afraid to even say the words you cannot say. He helped start a cultural discussion about the role of language in our society and helped to break down taboos around words like piss, fuck, mother, and tits. However, this discussion about language is even more important than it was 50 years ago. Now it's not just words that are taboo, but ideas too. Books are being banned, and people are being canceled left and right. Freedom of speech was challenged in the 1970s, and still is today, but the more concerning thing is the challenging of freedom of one's own ideas.